Welcome to the Captain's Table. I'm Captain Shan, and I want to help you run Star Trek role-playing games that flow well. Improv tends to be vague. There can be lots of lulls where the players are thinking things over and you're waiting for them to lead the action. But the GM can't fall asleep. The GM can't push the players into acting until they are ready to act in the way that suits them, generally. So the GM needs to constantly be listening to know when to add something in. And that's tricky. It can often feel very uncomfortable for the GM just sitting there waiting. You feel like you're not doing your job because you haven't spoken in 10 minutes. But you need to let the players process things for themselves. Right? They need to have an opportunity to interpret what you've already told them, to get a feel for the landscape that they're in, metaphorically or literally, and figure out what their characters would do in that situation, how their characters would respond to it. That's not going to come to all players instantly. Right? Sometimes they need time to think things through, to discuss amongst themselves what the situation is and resolve their own differing interpretations of what you've told them. And you can often get a pretty good idea of whether they've been listening to you correctly or not, whether they heard what you said or whether they've misheard you, misinterpreted, made up their own version of things. That's sometimes useful, sometimes harmful, but you've got to be on top of it either way. You've got to pay attention to what they're saying. We have a cliche in my role-playing circles, which is 20 minutes to get through a door. And this goes back to an Aliens versus Predator game that we once played in, run by my friend Jamie. And we basically didn't even start the first adventure. We were on a spaceship docked at a space station, and we were pretty sure that there were going to be scary aliens inside the station somewhere. So we spent over 20 minutes, I'm not sure who timed it exactly, but a long time, just discussing how we were going to walk through the very first door, what we were going to do to protect ourselves from the imagined threat on the other side there. And of course that infuriated the GM, and eventually he had to express his stress to us and let us know that we were being silly. But this happens with role-playing games. With a board game, it's obvious. You take your turn, you're done. Next player, right? They take their turn, they're done. With a more improvised story, what is the right thing to do? It's not always obvious. And sometimes you've got to sit and think about it. So this is where the GM needs to provide useful nudges. Let the players know when they're being silly, and you can provide that information earlier on. You don't have to wait 20 minutes before you speak up and let them know that they've completely wasted everybody's evening. As soon as you hear them saying something that sounds completely misguided, you can say, well, you can make a roll for me on that. You can check the archives on that. You can, whatever hint you've got to give them to point out to them that they're going off on a wrong tangent. And similarly, you can give them positive feedback when they are moving in the right direction. Well, we say right direction here, we mean in a constructive direction, something that isn't sitting around talking about how to walk through a door for 20 minutes. All of this depends on the GM paying attention. This is my main advice here. You need to know what your players are thinking. You need to keep on top of how they're making their decisions, so that you can help them spot the really rotten decisions. This doesn't mean you're making their decisions for them. You're not protecting them from stupid decisions or misguided decisions or anything like that. But mainly here we're trying to get the pacing right. We're figuring out how do you keep the game moving. And it's very easy for them to get stuck in long debate. How do you prevent the long debate? By paying attention to what they're saying and giving them the little nudges, the guidance that they need to know that this direction, you don't need to waste your time thinking about that, discussing that for another 5 minutes, 10 minutes, however long. Don't worry about that, that's not worth discussing. This other direction you're discussing, not promising you that it's going to work, but at least it's not a crazy line of thought. And they can hopefully get the right idea that way. Sometimes things won't flow nicely anyway, sometimes you do the best job you can and it still goes wrong, but you can at least smooth the flow of the game if you are able to give them those little bits of guidance as they go along. How do you give them the right guidance? You pay attention. Not really much more to it than that. Otherwise, how do you choose the correct pacing for a game that is open-ended and doesn't have a particular goal per minute, per hour, however you want to manage the rate of your gameplay? It's up to the individual GM and group, right? Some people like to rush through as much as possible in an evening and feel like they're being productive. If your group is like that, you should be able to keep up with that. If they prefer to think things through deeply and debate things in a lot of detail, you need to be aware of that as well and give them the room to do that. You're not going to know this with a new group, people you've never played with before. You've got to get used to people's particular style of play, but you'll get the hang of it eventually, right? And once you've got the hang of it, then it's also much easier to listen to what they're saying and spot when they're stuck, when they've hit a brick wall. And then well, now it's time to nudge them along. Another pretty obvious, pretty useful way to manage your pacing is to keep an eye on the clock. If you know that you've got to finish playing at 10, make sure that by 9 o'clock you've achieved what you wanted to achieve a third of the way through. By 10 o'clock you are 2/3 of the way through, etc. Okay? Depends on your own group, depends on your own circumstances. Some groups are happy to stretch on for hours and hours into the wee hours of the morning. If that's what works for you, don't worry about the clock so much. Obviously make sure that people get a healthy amount of sleep at least, but you don't have to constantly watch the time. If everybody's got a bedtime, if it's a school night, definitely helps to have a clock in front of you that you can monitor. I wouldn't worry about it that much. It doesn't have to be a rigid schedule, but you should at least keep yourself aware of whether things are slowing down or speeding up, whether you're going to run out of time or not. Otherwise, there's not really too much to discuss about the pacing of your games. Just keep aware of it. And so long as you do that, it should be comfortable enough for everyone, it should be fun enough for everyone. Nobody should feel too rushed or too bored of waiting for something to happen. Again, depends on the group. Get to know your own group and pay attention to them, and you'll find a way to make it work well enough for what you need. And there's not really more to it than that, just make it work.